Many leaders wear labels the way people wear clothes. They change depending on the day, the season, or even the room they walk into. Visionary in one setting, purpose-driven when the conversation turns to business, servant leader in another. And most of the time, those labels come from a sincere desire to lead well. They reflect aspiration, conviction, even a desire to align leadership with something deeper. But sometimes the label gets ahead of the formation. A label has a very specific purpose. A label exists to identify what's inside of something. The tag inside a jacket tells you the material it's made of. The badge on the back of a car tells you what engine is under the hood. And the label on a whiskey bottle tells you what's inside the bottle. The distillery, the mash bill, the age. In every case, the label comes after the thing itself has been defined. But leadership doesn't work that way. In leadership, the label often comes first. Sometimes that label is a title that describes the role. CEO, founder, executive director, senior leader. Those titles say something about the responsibility and authority. They say nothing about the substance of leadership within that role. Other times, the labels are more personal, perfectionist, detail-oriented, analytical, process-driven. Sometimes labels come from others. The fixer, the closer, the one who gets things done. And still other times, we assign labels to ourselves as a way of steadying ourselves, especially in those moments where we're still working out if we belong in the room that we're standing in. So the label becomes something that we lean on, and something others begin to lean on as well. But when leadership is grounded in something deeper, the label becomes less important, because what's inside becomes clear. Alignment shows up in decisions. Consistency shows up in behavior. Purpose becomes visible in the way people are led. At that point, the label simply describes what has already been formed. The whiskey world understands this better than most, because in whiskey, the label isn't added first. It's one of the very last things that gets added. Over the past decade, something interesting has happened in the whiskey world. It seems like everyone got in on the whiskey boom. Actors, athletes, musicians, celebrities. Suddenly it felt like everyone had their own whiskey. Beautiful bottles, slick branding, stories told on the label. And in many cases, those brands were introduced as if the person behind them had suddenly become a master distiller. For the record, there's nothing inherently wrong with a celebrity whiskey. Some of the ones I've tasted are actually pretty good. But most of those celebrity brands didn't begin by creating whiskey. They began with whiskey that had already existed. Somewhere, a distillery had already done the long, hard work of creating it. The grain had been milled, the mash had been fermented, the spirit had been distilled, and the barrels had been filled and left to age. Years of process had already shaped what was inside those barrels. The bottle was designed, the story was written, and the label was printed. Only then did the new brand arrive. And then the whiskey was poured into something new. Again, nothing wrong with that, but it reveals something important. The whiskey going into those bottles already had its identity. No matter what was printed on the label, it was the process that shaped what it would become. And that's the thing about labels. They don't create identity. They simply describe what's already there. When someone is really evaluating a whiskey, when they pick up a bottle, they're usually not focused on the logo or the backstory. They're asking, Where was it distilled? How long did it age? What's the mash bill? And who actually made this whiskey? Because they know the character of the spirit comes from the process that shaped it and the people who made it. The label simply tells the story. And that order matters more than we think. In leadership, labels are useful. They help people move quickly. They build trust. They create clarity in complex environments. Over time, those labels can become associated with results. The strategist helps shape direction. The operator keeps things moving. The one who gets things done becomes someone others rely on. Those patterns, that consistency, that's what drives success. And because of that, the label can start to carry weight. It becomes something others rely on, something they come to expect. And over time, we start to feel that too. We feel the need to live up to it, to keep showing up in the same way, because it worked. It created results. It built momentum. It helped build something meaningful. And when something works, we tend to go back to it, reinforce it, and even build on it. Until eventually, it stops being something we do and starts becoming something we believe about ourselves. And this is where something begins to shift. It's almost like taking the label on a whiskey bottle and letting it define what's inside instead of the other way around. In whiskey, that would never work. The spirit is already formed. The label is just there to describe it. But in leadership, the opposite can happen. The label starts shaping how the leader sees themselves and can even begin to limit what's possible. Instead of asking what next might look like, the leader begins to protect that label. In other words, the label starts to define identity. And that's where the tension really begins to rise. The tension between what we've built and what we're built for. What we've built is real. Our careers, our reputation, our work. But what we're built for? That doesn't always fit neatly inside the labels that helped get us here. And when we let those labels become the way that we define ourselves, it can become harder to see ourselves in a different light. Harder to imagine something different. Harder to recognize what might be unfolding in our next season. I've been having more and more conversations with leaders who find themselves in this exact moment. I had coffee with a leader not too long ago who is navigating a career transition. Their company was restructuring and it was time for them to move on. They had spent decades in the same organization, in the same role, building a career. Over time, the labels attached to them were pretty firmly in place. So when they started thinking about what the next season might look like, their thinking kept circling back to the same place. Similar titles, similar functions, the same level of responsibility. A place where those labels still fit. And it became clear just how powerful those labels had become. They had shifted from describing what they did to defining who they believed they were. And when this happens, it can detour purpose. Because the same labels that help build success can make it harder to see the leader we're still becoming. And this is where the whiskey metaphor really starts to matter. And because in whiskey, identity never comes from the label. It always comes from what's been formed through the process. The grain that was selected, the mash that was fermented, the spirit that was distilled, and the years spent aging inside oak barrels. That's what makes the whiskey. not the label that gets placed on the bottle. The identity of the Spirit is formed long before the label ever appears. The label is simply something that tells the story. And it does so in leadership too. Those labels become part of the story, but identity is formed through the process, through decisions and pressure, through uncertainty and reflection, through time, and through an understanding of our unique talents and gifts. And it comes through distillation, where everything that doesn't belong gets removed. If you and I were a bottle of whiskey carefully crafted by a master distiller, we wouldn't need a label to know what we're made of or what we're capable of. And over time, others would know that too. This might be a good place to pause for a second. If this conversation has you wondering about the labels attached to your leadership, here are a few questions to sit with honestly. What labels have attached themselves to how you lead? I'm not just talking about the titles that you hold, but the descriptions that you've come to believe about yourself. The ones you rely on, the ones others expect, the ones that have followed you from one season into the next. And then maybe a second question. Where have those labels served you well? And where might they be limiting what you believe is possible? Where have they helped create clarity, and where might you be protecting them? Because for many leaders, the tension isn't in a lack of clarity. It's being so closely aligned to what has worked or created results that it becomes harder to see what might be unfolding next. And it's worth saying that I'm not saying that the labels are wrong. It just means that they might not tell the whole story of what you were built for. They may be overshadowing your purpose, the spirit inside your bottle. Identity isn't something that we assign or something that we're given. It's something that's revealed and formed. And just like that distillation process, it requires removing what doesn't belong, so what is true can remain. So maybe one more question to sit with this week. If your labels were removed, what would still be true about how you lead? Because that answer is much closer to your identity than any label could ever be. If you've ever gone to a whiskey tasting, you write down notes of what you've tasted, things that stood out to you, and things that you want to remember. Here are my tasting notes from today. Yours might be different. And if you'd like to go a little bit deeper, I put together additional tasting notes for this episode at craftedclarity.net. 1. Labels are useful, but they have a place. In leadership, labels aren't the problem. They help teams move faster. They create clarity in complex environments. They even help build trust and momentum over time. And many of us have used labels to steady ourselves, especially in moments where we've questioned whether we belong in the room. But labels are never meant to carry identity. They can describe how we contribute, but they can't define who we are. 2, labels travel with us, even when the seasons change. One of the challenges with labels is that they tend to follow us from one season into the next. The label that made sense in one role can shape how we see what's possible in the next. And in seasons of transition, that matters. Because growth often requires movement. And movement becomes harder when we're trying to make the next season fit the last one. Recognizing labels we're carrying is what allows us to move through a season instead of staying anchored to it. And the third, identity is formed, not assigned. In whiskey, the label comes last. The identity of the spirit is shaped through process, through time, pressure, and refinement. And that's the same for you and I. What's true about you as a leader has already been forming through the decisions you've made and the pressure you've navigated and the seasons that you've walked through. The work now isn't to find a better label. It's to continue the process and remove what doesn't belong anymore. Thanks for joining me today, and remember, clarity isn't found. It's crafted. Thanks for listening to Crafted Clarity. If you're a leader wrestling with the tension between success and significance, or if you're trying to align your work with a deeper calling, I'd love to connect with you. If your organization is facing questions about strategy, whether it's alignment, ROI, or building confidence in your team, this is the work we do every day at iBrand. And if you walk this journey yourself, or maybe you're right in the middle of it, I'd love to hear your story and maybe even share it here on the podcast. You can find me at craftedclarity.net.